Welcome to the next in our series of the Folklore lunch presentations. Today the lecture is titled Nature, Memory and Nation, the Dnipro Wetlands and Kakhovka Reservoir in the National Narrative. I am happy to welcome Anna Olenenko. She is a graduate student. Oh, okay. She's a PhD student in modern languages and cultural studies in the media and cultural studies stream. And she wears that hat as student and is the research assistant for Dr. Natalie Hanenko-Friesen. But she also has a couple of other hats. She's a regional representative of Ukraine and member of the board of the European Society for Environmental History. She's also a co-founder of the
NHSTA. Environmental History of Ukraine Research Group.
Okay. She graduated from Zaporizhzhia National University in 2007 and got her Candidate of Science in History degree from the National Academy of Sciences of Ukraine in 2013. As you can probably guess from the title, Anna's research interests are related to the environmental history of Ukraine, especially the steppe region and animal studies. Her latest publication is a chapter that she co-authored with Stefan Dorandel, titled In Quest of Development to Territorialization and Transformation of the Southern Ukrainian Wetlands. She also wrote a chapter titled Camels in European Russia, Exotic Farm Animals and Agricultural Knowledge, and it was published in Thinking Russia's History of Environmentally in 2023. So a lot of involvement, that's just a short list. But in 2023, I think her focus changed just a little bit, or became more, focused. The world was shaken by the news of the disruption of the Kakhovka Dam. It caused the largest environmental war crime since Russia's invaded Ukraine in 2022. The event found a wide response in Ukrainian society and revived the discussions about the reasonableness of the construction of the Kakhovka Reservoir back in the 1950s. So, which flooded a historically, economically, and culturally important landscape, which is the Dnipro Wetlands. So in her paper, she argues that in the search for national identity, the image of the Dnipro Wetlands, shrouded in Cossack legends and oral stories of the local population, was resuscitated as a national symbol after gaining independence, which the whole event has intensified after the destruction of the dam and emerging possibilities to revive the Dnipro Wetlands. So I'm going to turn the floor over to you, Anna, and you can share with us what you found out.
Okay, thank you so much, Larissa, for the introduction. Hello, everyone. I'm really happy to finally present during the Folklore lunch, since I've been here as PhD student for 2 years, I guess. Yeah. So this is my first time presentation during these events. So today I will talk about Dnipro Wetlands and Kakhovka Reservoir and the national narrative which has been changed throughout the centuries. I was trying to include a lot of information, a lot of different actors who was involved in those questions, a lot of time periods. I hope that it will help to understand what is Dnipro Wetlands, what is Kakhovka Reservoir, how they are interrelated, and how they change throughout the history. So, since the start of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, the term ecocide has become one of the most frequently used terms in the media, referring to the deliberate large-scale destruction of nature. And as I think as you know, for the last almost 3 years of the war, in connection to Kakhovka Dam disaster, this term ecocide was used most frequently. According to the Google Trends, of course, the destruction of Kakhovka Reservoir, we can see the dates in Google Trends when those terms were the most popular worldwide and in Ukraine. The Kakhovka disruption was on June 6, 2023. So it took only a few days for the torrent of water from the Kakhovka Reservoir to reach the Black Sea, flooding all the downstream lowlands along the Dnipro River, causing widespread human suffering and wreaking chaos on the ecosystem of the lower Dnipro. Besides flooding cities and villages, the destruction of the dam has severely impacted diversity in the region and caused irreversible damage to the Nizhnodniprovsky National Park, the Dnipro River Delta, and other Ramsar sites that preserve unique wetland ecosystem. The disaster also affected areas along the Dnipro upstream of the dam. So the Kakhovka Reservoir, which extends from the Dnipro hydroelectric power station Dnipro has in Zaporizhia to Kakhovka has, was drained of most of its water within a few days, causing mass die-off of fish, as you can see on those pictures, putting cooling system of Zaporizhia nuclear station, which is Energodar, into danger, and limiting the supply of drinking water to the to the major cities in the south of Ukraine, like Zaporizhia, Kryvyi Rih, etc. So Kakhovka Reservoir helped to irrigate lands in the steppe, so it served like an irrigation system for those crops in the south of Ukraine. Of course, half of Ukrainian Black Earth region, so-called Chernozem, is now occupied, but still a lot of fields need water in order to continue to provide the world with the grain. So the Kakhovka disaster questionable issue on the Ukraine as a breadbasket of Europe, and not only Europe, because many countries in other regions in Africa and Asia are dependent on Ukrainian grain. I mean that after the war started, it seems to me that the world speak about Ukrainian grain more than about Ukrainian people. So and they worrying about export of Ukrainian grain more than suffering of Ukrainian people in Ukraine. So this is the whole other story. I just wanted to highlight how Kakhovka Dam affected not only Ukraine, not only Ukrainian people and Ukrainian land, but people all over the world. So the Kakhovka disaster was closely covered in the media by Ukrainian press and widely discussed on the social media, with minute-by-minute updates on flooding levels, reports on evacuees, efforts by volunteers to rescue people, pets, wild animals, along with coverage of the broader consequences of the breach. So taken together, this coverage paints an alarming picture of the damage already inflicted and greater damages that lie ahead. So the destruction of the dam was named as an act of ecocide or ecoterrorism or environmental war crime, and this disaster, this war crime and this act of ecocide found a wide response in Ukrainian society and revived the discussion about the reasonableness of construction of Kakhovka Reservoir in the first place, and the necessity of reconstruction of this Kakhovka hydroelectric power station and dam and the reservoir after the end of the war, and the possibility to restore the environment which were modernized through the construction of this reservoir. So at first, predictions about the future of those dry territories of Kakhovka Reservoir, which was the bottom of Kakhovka Reservoir for the last 70 years, were actually negative. The main fear was that it would turn into the desert soon. However, nature began to come to life, and wetlands ecosystems began to grow again, as you can see on those pictures on the bottom. So why again? Because before the construction of the reservoir in 1950s, there were wetlands there which were flooded because of the construction. So now the authorities and different state institutions and those who are in power now, they are planning to rebuild reservoir, and after the end of the war, of course, and again flood the wetlands. However, a lot of people oppose it. In my research, I try to show why this is happening, why there is such a contradiction, and why don't people want benefits from the reservoir but choose to restore a wetlands ecosystem instead, and why those wetlands are so important for Ukrainians. And today I will try to show the historical, cultural, economic, symbolic significance of those Dnipro wetlands for Ukrainians, and how the narratives on these wetlands has been changed throughout the time. So what is Dnipro wetlands? Dnipro wetlands, or plavny in Ukrainian, were the unique ecosystem in the steppe. Although there are a lot of different wetlands along the Dnipro River, the largest of them were located in the south. They were called Bazavluk and Konka Plavny, and extended from present-day Zaporizhia to the confluence of the tributary Rohachik River and the Dnipro. So extensive spring floods of the river made it possible to create a unique microclimate in the steppe. So the Dnipro wetlands represented an overly moistened terrace of the river valley. During the annual flood, the wetlands turned into the solid water space, and this allowed to create the huge and power layer of this black soil land in the steppe. Because there were a lot of lakes, a lot of rivers, there were a lot of fish, and fish, of course, attracted a lot of animals. So it was a unique ecosystem with a huge biodiversity in the steppe region. And of course, it played a crucial role for the local inhabitants who lived nearby those Dnipro wetlands. Before turning to the historical part of my research, before the southern part of today's Ukraine were seized by Russian Empire in the last quarter of 18th century, the wetlands belonged to the Zaporizhian Cossacks. It was the last stretch of Cossack land before the border between Cossacks and Tatars. Before the Russian Empire conquest, the vast territories of the steppes and the land bordering the Dnipro Valley, Dnipro River, were filled by Cossacks' farms, so-called zemivniki, which were the base of Cossacks' economy at that time. And exactly in the wetlands, the majority of Zaporizhian sitches were located, which additionally gave value for these wetlands as a Cossack place in economic, military, cultural, etc. meanings. So it was a Cossack time when the name of those wetlands emerged. Veliki Lug, or Great Meadow, which I suppose you have heard a lot about those Great Meadow. So when the Russian Empire conquered the steppe, it perceived it as a wild and unpossessed, and thus one of the most urgent tasks of the Russian state was to organize the territory administratively and economically as a means of civilizing it. So this action cried out for knowledge of the southern lands, hence the scientific expeditions that began under Catherine the Great in the last quarter of 18th century. So state officials used the weapons of modern scientific knowledge, such as maps, inventories, statistics, etc., in order to reorganize the territory where the constant negotiation between water and land produced an environment that was considered less appropriate to the modern economy. So the imperial authorities initiated scientific research studies on the entire area, starting with the last quarter of 18th century, and those scientific inquiry would have helped them decide decide what to do with those new territories, how to colonize them, and how to organize the economic activity and the exploitation of their natural resources. So the scientific expeditions sponsored by the Imperial state produced various kinds of data which contained information about climate, about soils, about forests, river system, minerals, flora, fauna, and some other things. So over several decades, a sufficient number of the ethnographic and geographical descriptions accumulated, which gave the state a clearer picture of the wetlands in the south. Yet it was not the wetlands that were the immediate target of the scientists' interest, but rather the woodland that grew there. In the treeless landscape of the steppes, the woodlands were truly valued, and for example, in Katerinoslav province, woodlands accounted for 4% of the whole territory, and 63% of which was located exactly in the wetlands. So despite its poor quality, wetlands forest was of paramount significance to the locals for heating, for construction, and other purposes. So grand ideas about transforming the wetlands were not in short supply during the imperial period. Different authors proposed different projects for increasing the economic profitability in the wetlands. Throughout most of the 19th century, though, wetlands were discussed in the terms of afforestation, and in terms of amelioration, irrigation, drainage for reclaiming agricultural land. So basically, they tried to get those lands from the wetlands and turn them into the agricultural lands. However, such measures as drainage was too expensive for the Russian Empire, and they concentrate instead on making the steppe more suitable for agriculture through afforestation, through creation different shelter belts, ponds, etc. The only suggestion of the economic profitability of wetlands was done by authorship of Ignatiy Ryabinin, who worked in the Ministry of State Property of the Russian Empire. He proposed to use wetlands to swine breeding. The author pointed out that swine farming could become the most profitable in case of construction of the dam, which would protect wetlands from flooding of the Dnipro Wetlands, of Dnipro water in the spring, and drainage. But since, again, it was too expensive for the Russian Empire, to increase profitability of the wetlands, Ryabinin suggested to continue their afforestation, and he believed that the main tree had to be oak, so that swine breeding in the wetlands would reach a new level. However, Russian Empire did not implement any major project in the wetlands. It encountered multiple obstacles to organize territory as they wished. First, the landlords, they were not interested in the different reclamation projects of the wetlands. Second, the state lacked the necessary resources and technology. As we know, empire was not at the forefront of technological power and in the 19th century and the early 20th century. So until the end of the 19th century, imperial attempts to change the environment were impeded also by the lack of specialists. So all those efforts of so-called high modernist state on transforming the wetlands, as they called wastelands, into productive land were unsuccessful during this imperial time. And in opposite, locals who lived near the Dnipro wetlands interacted with those wetlands in a whole other way. So what role those wetlands played for the local residents? According to Ryabinin, there were a primitive economy of the wetlands, and you can read those quotes that he says that Ukrainians or local residents used wetlands like it was a primitive society, just gathering something from wetlands and not producing something more. So it was the limitation, in his words, of the using of these wetlands in the 19th century. But statistics from the end of the 19th century shows that, for example, in Katerinoslav province, the majority of wetlands was included into the Katerinoslav province. 27% of the wetlands were commons belonging to peasant communities, most of them Ukrainians. 65% belonged to the noble landowners, who were mostly of Russian origin, so it was Russian nobles there, and only 7% was state-owned. And the wetlands were not involved in the process of mass plowing of the steppe, and only few landowners began plowing and sowing small areas of the wetlands, and that is why many owners preferred to lease those wetlands and instead of its exploitation. So this led to the situation that the real owners of the wetlands were local peasants who either rent wetlands or use them illegally. The main income they received from the vines and hay. The wetlands were covered with forests, mostly willow and oak, and they were used them in the households for the furniture, for baskets, for bags, and a lot of different stuff. And of course for heating. So the wetlands were the main source of hay, which was harvested from the wetlands, hay fields for the winter food of cattle and cane, which were used for heating houses and as building materials. Roofs also were covered with it. So also fisheries, it was crucial occupation for the local residents who lived near the Dnipro Wetlands, and often during the flooding the fish came from the Dnipro along small rivers to the wetland lakes for spawning. The main task was not to frighten off those fish, and when it started to go back to the Dnipro, people need to create obstacles and not let go back for those fish. And to do this, rivers and the ducks were blocked completely with nets, or when water decreased, with pollen. So the wetlands favorably influenced also not fishery economy, but also cattle breeding. In the steppe region. In the pastures, locals grazed cattle from the spring to mid-autumn. Frequent cases were when peasants impound their livestock into landowner wetlands for almost a year without the knowledge of the owner, and therefore without any pain. According to the landowners, it was very difficult to keep trapped in the wetlands in order to avoid illegal grazing cattle. And we have a lot of different evidences when landowners complained that a lot of peasants used their wetlands for grazing their cattle. Even some legal measures failed to curb the exploitation of wetlands by locals. In the second half of the 19th century, for example, a law was introduced recognizing wetlands as the forest with a protective function, mandating their exemption from exploitation. So these regulations introduced significant restrictions, such as prohibiting haymaking and grazing cattle in the glades between protected forests and the river banks. However, these impositions sparked resistance and discontent among the local population, who avoid the law by disregarding it and continuing their traditional practices. Together with some kind of economic values of the wetlands, 19th century also brought the understanding of its historical or cultural value. In the times of rising of Romanticism and the recognition of importance of wetlands, or better to say, Veliki Lug, in the national narrative appeared for the first time. It was the period when Cossack folklore gained enormous popularity among researchers who gathered and studied it actively. So it appeared that Veliki Lukh and Dnipro were intervened in many different tales, legends from Cossack times, and in Cossack and peasant folklore, the Great Meadow represents father and provider imaginary, as you can see here in those quotes. So the Cossacks and Veliki Lukh feature prominently in the 19th century romantic works by avid promoters of the Ukrainian national idea, who turned to their Cossack roots in search of national identity and coalesced a narrative of the ancestral homeland. And the historiographical process in Ukrainian territories in the later 19th century and early 20th century developed in the context of national renaissance and the formation of Ukrainian nation, and thus the main historiographic themes were national sovereignty and exclusivity, romantic rebellion, heroization of the Cossacks, and idealization of the attributes of Cossack statehood and geographical context were extraordinarily important in embellishing these themes, and landscape were endowed with symbolic meaning that were significant for informing a national semantic. So since 5 of the 7 Cossack siege fortresses, Tomakivka, Bazavluk, Chertomlik, Makitan, and the new siege were built in the wetlands in the works of historians, folklorists, and regional anthropologists such as Dmytro Yavornitsky, Yakov Novitsky, Adrian Kashenko, and others. Veliki Lukh played a foundational role as a national cradle of Ukrainian Cossackdom. And thanks for their research work, the Great Meadow became a marker of the frontier of Ukrainian domain. So the historical Ukrainian territory of the Veliki Lukh was contrasted with the northern Black Sea region as a non-historical Novorossiya, a land colonized by Russian Empire. Going to the Soviet times, if in the Russian Empire wetlands were considered mainly from the point of forest, the Soviet times brought some kind of new views on the wetlands, and from the early 20th century, wetlands became the object for agricultural and hydrotechnic transformations. So after the after the installation of Bolshevik power, as with all Soviet republics, Ukraine was involved in the process of industrial and agrarian transformation of nature, and the steppe region continued to be targeted as their climatic conditions like high temperatures, unstable and low precipitation, droughts and dry winds impeded high agricultural production. So the early Soviet governments considered that the nature of the steppe had to be corrected or tamed, and the wetlands, still considered as the wastelands, might have turned out to be helpful. Alexander Yaroshevsky, whose quote you can see on the screen, Ukrainian engineer of the Southern Regional Ameliorative Organization in Odessa, suggested that the wetlands should supply water to a network of irrigation systems throughout the southern steppes. Wetlands, he posited, could be useful as long as a series of dams and canals were constructed that would allow both reclamation of agricultural land and protection against floods and for the inhabited areas. So this quote demonstrates thinking about Ukrainian wetlands and suggests ways that Soviet power should engage in making them economically profitable. As well as during the imperial times. So from the beginning of the collectivization process in the 20s and 30s of 20th century, the Dnipro Wetlands were gradually assigned to collective and state farms, which while local villagers received small plots of just 0.15 hectares per family. So the collective farms used the wetlands natural pastures for graze the cattle, and every year those territories in the wetlands for the collective farms were increased. For example, to provide an additional source of feed in the Zaporizhia region in 1946, it was decided to use the Dnipro Wetlands for grazing in the autumn-winter period, for which 22 hectares of land were allocated. And to implement the wintering of livestock in the wetlands, cattle breedings, bases and housing for collecting farmers were built, as you can see in this picture. So for more effective use of the wetlands, it was necessary to build different infrastructure such as roads, bridges, houses for the caretakers and ferries to cross small rivers in the wetlands. And all of these measures were the part of the Soviet so-called productive wetland plan. Yet wetlands were not an environment easily adapted to economic plans of Soviet state. Their specific vegetation, shrubs, interfered with Soviet plans for productive land use. In addition, the annual floods left behind cover vegetation residues that delayed the grass grow. Tree stumps prevented the mechanization of hay gathering. So thus regional authorities tasked some members of the collective farms with finding ways how to improve the quality of wetlands meadow grass and increasing their yields. So to achieve that, there were created different kolhosp teams which tried to find those ways how to improve those production in the wetlands. But between 1920 and 1948, different state and scientific institutions, collective farms, they tried to include wetlands into the Soviet economy. However, those efforts were also unsuccessful, as well as in the Imperial times. It was unsuccessful until the implementation of Stalin's plans for transformation of nature, which was launched in 1948. So this plan was an attempt to correct the unpleasant features of the steppe, including wetlands. And according to this plan, together with other measures, Soviet states initiated the construction of Kakhovka hydroelectric power station on the Dnipro River. The decree was issued by the Council of Ministers of the USSR on July 12, 1952. Sorry, I have some troubles today with those numbers. So the reservoir was filled between 1955 and 1958. The majority of wetlands above the new dam disappeared under the waters of the new reservoir since no other plans worked on them. So on this map you can see how the reservoir, those borders of reservoir, just repeat the borders of the previous Dnipro wetlands. So construction of the Kakhovka Reservoir meant huge changes in the area. Preparation of the reservoir required the clearing of trees in the wetlands, which, by the way, we can see now when the level of Kakhovka Reservoir were decreased. I took these pictures in Zaporizhia in 2023. So it says that not everybody took seriously their job, and sometimes trees were not cut down before the reservoir was filled by waters. Also different measures were, for example, the destruction and relocation of existing administrative and residential buildings and roads and railways from the flood zone. And around 34,000 people from 75 settlements were settled, and more than 200,000 hectares of land were flooded when the Kakhovka Reservoir was constructed. But unlike other hydroelectric power plants in Ukraine or in Soviet Union, HES on the Dnipro, Kakhovka HES, was not built exclusively to generate electricity, but also it was the main aim to create a reservoir to irrigate the arid lands of Kherson, Zaporizhia region and Crimea. And its construction was seen as the final phase of local old struggle with those aridity of the steppes. Building the Kakhovka Reservoir was accompanied by an active propaganda campaign in the Soviet Union. Party organizations hired specialists in agriculture and forestry, secondary school teachers and other specialists to do propaganda work. Hundreds of popular science and popular magazines described in vivid colors the coming transformation of nature in the steppe zone of Ukraine resulting from Kakhovka Reservoir. The periodicals dazzled with reports on the achievements of Soviet science and technology and on the boon expected by the region's populations. Soon after the reservoir was completely filled, even new touristic routes were created that showed the changes undergone by the Dnipro. One of the published tourist routes mentioned that wetlands, once they represented the riches of the land and its ancient residents. Now this role is played by the reservoir, the Kakhovka Sea. Today it represents the multi-million riches of Zaporizhia Oblast. So this new mythology began to be formed in the very early stages of the construction of Kakhovka hydroelectric power station, and the first recollections, interviews and accounts of the direct participants in the design and construction date to this time. This includes the collection of poems by various authors about the start of construction of hydroelectric station and dam, which was called Na Kakhovskom Плацдарме. And the authors strove to illustrate the self-sacrificing labor of the builders. But obviously there was also another goal: to integrate the as yet incomplete hydroelectric power station and the sea into the Soviet Ukrainian historical and cultural canon. So the highly symbolic figure of Taras Shevchenko in this canon was cynically deployed to sanction the image of Dnipro, Ukraine's the major river of Ukrainians, which was transformed by Soviet construction. As you can see on this picture, this is a poem about the construction of the Kakhovka Reservoir and the meanings of this construction. So even Kobzar, even Taras Shevchenko can see how important and how huge and how significant those gigantic Soviet buildings, constructions are. Also, even scholarly academic world played a role in establishing a new myth around the Kakhovka Reservoir, and the construction of it inspired dozens of compositions for diplomas, dissertations, conferences, etc. For example, in 1952, Kyiv-Shevchenko State University published a book by Yuri Sholomy, a candidate of economic sciences, that predicted exclusively positive consequences of the construction of hydroelectric power station. And another dissertation by Olenenko was defended in 1955 before the construction was even finished, and it was typical example of researching the Communist Party's struggle for construction of the of HES. And the author particularly paid attention to mass political work that carried out social competition among the dam builders. In similar studies, the construction of Kakhovka complex was declared to be one of the most important steps to establishing a material technical foundation for communism. So in some transformation of the landscape were explained, and some justified by the common needs of progress, and those scholarly work and different propaganda materials, cultural works on these topics focused on the new possibilities enabled by the hydroelectric power station, and Plavny or wetlands were not mentioned when the conversation turned to the man-made seas. So whole other story revealed in the oral histories of the local residents who lived near at first the Dnipro Wetlands and then on the banks of Kakhovka Reservoir. I think you have heard about that, but in Zaporizhia since 2000, historical department of faculty in Zaporizhia National University, together with Zaporizhia Scientific Society of Yakov Novitsky, they organized oral history expeditions in the villages of steppe Ukraine, so in different regions, different oblasts like Dnipropetrovsk, Zaporizhia, Kherson, Mykolaiv, Odessa, etc. And the main goal of this expedition was to collect oral histories from the local population, which reveal the peculiarities of the perception of social, economic life, everyday life, traditions, etc. And for my research, I used testimonies collected in the several villages around the Kakhovka Reservoir. So, having analyzed interviews, it appeared that for local residents in those villages which were located near the Dnipro Wetlands and near the Kakhovka Reservoir, after that, the construction of the dam and flooding of the wetlands became one of the most significant events in their lives, together with Holodomor, together with Second World War, and the collapse of Soviet Union. And here I would like to highlight some aspects of the oral histories on the Dnipro wetland, in the Dnipro wetlands. So, first of all, I would like to say that the concept of place is crucial for understanding how individuals and communities construct their identities. Place, it's not just a backdrop for the human activity, it's actively involved in the shaping the narratives and memories of those who inhabit it. In case of the wetlands, the landscape itself becomes a character in the oral histories of the southern Ukraine. And those wetlands emerged as more than just a physical space, they are deeply embedded in the identity of the local population. And those recollections of oral histories I mentioned illustrate how place and identity are interwoven, with the wetlands serving as both a literal and symbolic anchor for the communities that lived near them. So the wetlands, according to the oral histories, the wetlands were essential to the economic life of the southern Ukraine. As the engine of economic activity in the steppe zone, they were not only vital for agriculture, but also for various forms of traditional craftsmanship, such as basket weaving and beekeeping. The rivers, lakes, forests that made up the wetlands created a unique microclimate, supporting diverse livelihoods and sustaining the rural economy, which were not the part of the kolhosp system. This economic significance is a central theme in the oral histories, which, with residents recalling how the wetlands provided both sustains and income, ensuring their survival through periods of hardship. Also, the wetlands' importance extends beyond their economic value. For the locals, these landscapes were integral to their personal and collective identities. Memories of the wetlands are often infused with a deep sense of nostalgia, particularly as they are recalled in connection with the childhood and youth. So this nostalgia is not merely about longing for the lost past, it reflects the deep-rooted connection between the people and the land. So the wetlands are remembered not just as place where crops were grown or where livestock was grazed, but a space of play, exploration and freedom. The vivid recollections of childhood games and swimming in the river are a testament to the role of the wetlands played in shaping the lived experience for the younger generations. So also the wetlands represent as a site of resistance, where the local population asserted their autonomy against external pressures. Through the lens of oral history, the wetlands emerge as a powerful symbol of resistance. One of the most striking aspects of the wetlands history is their resistance to collectivization. Much longer than other lands, the wetlands remained outside the system, continuing to exist under the form of common ownership that allowed local villagers to maintain a degree of control over their lands. The unique status of the wetlands can be seen as an act of resistance against the Soviet states' efforts to centralize and control agriculture. By preserving their traditional use of the wetlands, the local population resisted the force of collectivization, asserting their rights to manage and benefit from their resources in ways that aligned with their long-standing practices and needs. And this autonomy provided a crucial means of survival during some the most difficult periods in Ukrainian history, such as Holodomor, such as Second World War, and the famine after the war. So the ability to forage, to fish, to graze livestock in the wetlands meant that the residents of the steppe zone were able to avoid the catastrophic famines that ravage other regions of Ukraine. And the oral histories highlight how the wetlands' rich resources helped sustain life when there were no other ways. So wetlands also played a crucial role in the physical resistance during the wartime. The oral histories recount how the wetlands were used by local residents and by partisans as a hiding place from occupying forces. The dense forests, river network of rivers, canals, lakes, etc., made wetlands an ideal location for hiding, because only those who were familiar with those landscape could navigate its hidden paths. So throughout oral histories, we see how landscape became an active participant in the lives of the local population, shaping their economic activities, childhood memories, and even their acts of resistance, and therefore became the part of their identity. Since wetlands were so important for the locals, obvious question was if they resist to the flooding and how. And when respondents were asked what was your reaction on flooding the wetlands, they often answered, well, what could we do? I guess it was necessary. And back then, nobody could even think about expressing their point of view in any way. So the sense of this helplessness conveyed in the respondents' words, what could we do, speaks to the overwhelming force of state power during the Soviet era and absence of agency. But on the other way, those oral histories evidences that people had their agency and they obtain or reclaim those agency now when they started to talk about those wetlands and talk about those tragical events connected with the flooding of the Dnipro wetlands. So to sum up, the narrative of Dnipro wetlands has been changed, as you saw, throughout the centuries, and after Ukraine became independent, discussions about transformation of the landscape of the southern Ukraine was replaced from the Soviet so-called progressivist or developmentists by a tragic or lamenting one. So in turn, it was subjected to nationalization, and wetlands became more associated with national Ukrainianness, and the Kakhovka Reservoir represented colonial oppression. It was intensified after the construction of Kakhovka hydroelectric power station, destruction of Kakhovka HES in 2023. The re-emergence of the wetlands has revived memories and emotions tied to the paradise lost in the 1950s and made walkable those who value nature, history and culture more than progress. So in the 2000s, local residents, the representative of so-called wetlands identity, we were talking about the tragedy of wetlands destruction after the act of ecocide in 2023. This story became the important part of the narrative in whole Ukraine, and it became important for the Ukrainians, not only the local residents. So in that way, Dnipro Wetlands became the part of identity of all Ukrainians. And it's interesting that in media dedicated to the Kakhovka disaster, authors usually use the term not wetlands or not plavny, but Veliki Lug, that additionally highlight the historical significance of this landscape for today's Ukrainians. And as it was back in 19th century, Veliki Lug and the Great Meadow are again being used to construct a semantics of freedom and defiance of the Ukrainian nation and statehood. Thank you for your attention.